Welcome to Codex, a history of video games. My name is Tyler Osby.
And I'm Mike Coletta.
And today we're going to be talking a little bit more about some home console stuff as well as some arcade stuff. Still in the sort of the twilight hours of the golden age of Atari, I want to say.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, the twilight hours.
Yeah. For reference for you guys, the book that we're currently going through right now is called The Ultimate History of Video Games by Stephen L. Kent. So if you want to follow along with us, that's what we're using right now. Once we finish with this book, we'll be doing other stuff as well. We're not just going to read this book and then be done, but that's kind of where we're at right now. So without further ado, Mike, you want to take it away?
Yeah, we're in Golden Age Part 2, Chapter 11, and it started in 1981, and that was arcade's biggest year.
Wow.
It's the biggest year for them, but with the big year, they also saw a lot of backlash towards arcade video games. For example, 15-year-old Steve Jurassic of Arlington Heights, Illinois, scored 15,963,100 points on a 16-hour game of Defender.
Wow.
But the problem was he did that during school hours, like he skipped out on school, and as a result of that, he was banned.
Oops.
I think he was banned from the arcade. It made it sound like he was banned from school for skipping school, but that was confused me a little bit. But I'm pretty sure he was banned from playing in that arcade. Another thing is a Pittsburgh City ordinance that prevented minors from playing during school hours. Oakland, California, City Council voted to ban minors from arcades during school hours. And it was international, too. The Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos banned video games and gave arcade owners 2 weeks to destroy their machines.
Whoa. He just straight up was like, nah.
Yeah, which is it seems very extreme.
Yeah.
Time magazine reported that Americans dropped 20 billion quarters into arcade machines in 1981, and that video game addicts, that's in quotes, spent 75,000 hours playing games. Arcade games made twice as much money in 1981 as all Nevada casinos combined.
Wow.
And according to Playmeter magazine, there were approximately 24,000 full arcades and 400,000 street locations, like in a restaurant or a bar.
Oh, yeah.
And I did a little research on top of the book, just trying to, give a little something.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2013, there were 19,354 incorporated cities in the USA. And assuming that's only gone up since 81, that means there was definitely at least enough full arcades for one in every incorporated city in America.
Wow, that's
which
a lot of
is pretty
arcades.
crazy to think about.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was a good year and a bad year, I guess, because the backlash started. Atari game designers, we're going to talk about them, the coin-op department specifically, were not treated well at this time either. Like, for it being a huge industry, they were not making a lot of money. I think they were making like $20,000 a year.
In $1980,
which is still not a lot.
That's probably $40-50K now.
Yeah. Ray Kassar thought competitors would steal his designers' games, so he never let the designers talk to the media at all. And meanwhile, though, other companies like Online Systems were redesigning variants of arcade games to play on the Apple, Atari, and Commodore home computers. And those designers were treated like rock stars compared to the Atari designers. They had like publicity and bonus checks and probably all sorts of like fun, cool, what is it called? Benefits, maybe like royalties, Also at this time for Atari was a game that was designed by the U.S. military called Military Battlezone.
Is this similar to Battlezone?
This is similar to Battlezone, and I think we forgot to mention who designed Battlezone last episode.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but I have it here. It's Ed Rothberg. He was the lead designer of Battlezone, because I think it was actually a team of a lot of people. And his group of retired Army generals contacted Atari about making a more realistic version of Battlezone designed to train soldiers. But all these designers and programmers at Atari did this because they didn't want to be a part of working for the U.S. government.
Bunch of hippies.
Exactly. They're like counterculture guys.
Yeah.
So they didn't want to do it. And but ended up they offered Atari a lot of money, and so they ended up doing it anyway. And Rothberg was working pretty much 3 months straight. There's a quote in the book where he said he didn't get to see his wife really ever during this time. Like, it was not a good time for him. His next project after the Military Battlezone was called Dragon Riders, which was a fantasy game based on an Anne McCaffrey novel. But Atari never got the licensing, so he designed this full game, but it never came out.
Oh, that's a bummer.
Yeah, but it was the first game based on a novel, was this game, Dragon Riders.
Oh, wow.
And his last game he worked on was called Warp Speed. And this was a high-speed outer space simulator where players attacked a fortress in space from the first-person view. But when it came out, they were like, another movie was coming out at that time called Star Wars.
Oh, that's like a really old movie.
Heard of it? Yeah. And George Lucas and Atari partnered up, and so they they altered all of the models in Warp Speed to become Star Wars. So that game became Star Wars.
Nice.
It was Warp Speed. They're like, oh, there's a movie, Star Wars. So
they saw an opportunity and they jumped on it.
Exactly, yeah. And now we get to talk about something that I was really excited to finally get into.
Ooh.
Nintendo.
Yes. Oh, because Nintendo's been strangely sort of absent. As big as they are now and as big as they were even throughout the history of video games, like at the very start, they weren't very big. They weren't a huge player until...
No, especially in the U.S., they weren't very big player at all. They had the Japanese... They were a big player in the Japanese market, but that was the thing. They had trouble breaking into the American market. And they were actually... Nintendo started as a 100-year-old playing card company. They've been around for a long time.
Wow.
And in 1980, Nintendo Company Limited president Hiroshi Yamauchi hired his son-in-law, Minoru Arakawa, to establish an operation in America to create Nintendo America. And he did this not only because he was his son-in-law, but also Arakawa had experience. He oversaw construction of a Canadian condominium project run by a Japanese construction company in North America. So he kind of had experience working in North America.
Okay, that makes sense.
For a Japanese company.
Yep.
So in April 1980, Arakawa set up an office in Manhattan and a warehouse in New Jersey just to start producing games and having games specifically shipped to the warehouse to distribute. And he found his first two distributors were Seattle-based entrepreneurs Ron Judy and Al Stone, and they owned a trucking company, but they moonlighted as game resellers. It's a cool thing to moonlight.
Just like selling games out of the back of a truck.
Essentially.
Want to buy some video games.
And they had been purchasing Nintendo games actually from Hawaii, because they brought a couple to Hawaii because it was kind of in the middle.
Yeah.
And then redistributing them in the continental U.S. And Arakawa offered to cover their expenses and pay them commission if they became consultant representatives of Nintendo of America.
Ooh.
Yeah. I like the name Nintendo of America.
Me too.
First came a game called Radar Scope, and that was a big failure. And they actually, it was confusing because they thought the game was a big hit in Japan, and it just didn't hit in the U.S., so they brought 3,000 units over, shipped from Japan. They sold 1,000 of those units, and then 2,000 of them sat in a warehouse until a certain special moment I'm about to talk about.
Oh boy, can't wait for this super special moment.
But Arakawa discovered that to ship to the East Coast actually added 2 extra weeks of shipping time because it had to go from Japan to the West Coast and then by truck
to the East Coast.
So what he did is he relocated their offices on the East Coast to Redmond, Washington.
Hey.
Washington State reference, that's where we're from.
Yeah, dude.
Yeah. And they also had some other failures at this time. It actually started off pretty rough for them. They had a game called Space Fever that failed, and a game called Sheriff that failed, and Radar Scope. But fortunately, there was a project that looked pretty promising when in 1977, Yamauchi, that's the president in Japan, hired a creative young college graduate with a degree in industrial design named Shigeru Miyamoto.
Oh.
Yeah,
that's my dude.
Miyamoto was an anomaly in Kyoto, Japan, because he played banjo, he loved bluegrass, and collected Beatles records.
Oh, wow.
He also loved designing toys. Like, he wanted to be a toy designer more than anything. In fact, after he created this game I'm about to talk about, he actually still told reporters he wanted to be a toy designer and not a video game designer.
It's just... his day job. Making video games is just Miyamoto's day job.
Yeah, he really liked toys. But his first job was actually design the art for the outside panels of the Radar Scope and Sheriff cabinets, the arcade cabinets. He was going to design those. And then in 1979, Yamauchi called Miyamoto into his office and asked him to design an arcade game. And Miyamoto said yes and was very excited. And he wanted his game to have a story. He didn't want it just to be like, you're shooting aliens. He's like, I want a story to be there.
Of which I'm a big fan of that genre.
Oh, yeah, don't get us wrong. This
shooting
podcast
aliens
is very pro shooting aliens.
Yeah.
I want to let you know that. But his story ended up about a gorilla that escaped his master and then kidnapped a carpenter's girlfriend.
Oh, boy.
And the carpenter had to save his girlfriend.
Classic story.
Yeah. And Miyamoto wanted to make the game more like towards English audiences. So he actually wanted to make it. The game was called Stubborn Gorilla in Japanese, but he looked in a Japanese to English dictionary and he decided to go with donkey for stubborn and Kong for gorilla, and thus was Donkey Kong.
Donkey Kong. I feel like if he had actually called it Stubborn Gorilla, it wouldn't have done nearly as well. Like Donkey Kong just has like a
It's a K sound, a KK.
Yeah, and it's
Donkey Kong.
It's like a sort of a mystery of like, what is Donkey Kong? Oh, Kong kind of monkey maybe involved.
Yeah.
You're like, that's is enough to like sort of pique your interest, right? Stubborn Gorilla doesn't sound like a fun game.
Yeah. Also, you have like we're actually going to get to this a little bit later, but the Kong name, like King Kong, had already come out at this time.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of unintentional cross marketing there too.
Right. Did they have any legal troubles with that?
Oh, we're going to get there.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, don't worry about that. Yamachi immediately recognized how special Donkey Kong was, and he told his son-in-law he was sending a new game that would make Nintendo one of the top companies in the U.S. And this could not have come at a better time for RoccoW, Al Stone, and Ron Judy, because Judy and Stone were going bankrupt because Radar Scope was a big failure, and then RoccoW struggled to pay rent. But luckily, he convinced their landlord of the warehouse, named Mario Segal, that he would be able to pay the rent later. And Mario's like, okay, I'll trust you. That's fine. And because of that, RoccoW changed the name of Jumpman the Carpenter to Mario in that man's honor.
Well, there you go.
And he's been Mario ever since.
Thanks, Mario Segal.
Yeah, and RoccoW wanted to trademark and patent Donkey Kong, so he took the game to Howard Lincoln, Ron Judy, and Al Stone's to Howard Lincoln, who was Ron Judy and Al Stone's lawyer. But the game did not really inspire a lot of confidence in them. They're like, what is this? Like, this is like you're like throwing barrels down and we're jumping over. Like, what is, like, why? This doesn't seem like a hit game. And, but what ended up happening is after, just like they did with, Al Alcorn did with Pong, RoccoW needed to test this game. So they put it at 2 bars in Seattle. They put it at the Spot Tavern in South Seattle, and Goldie's in the U District, the University District of Seattle.
Are those
and the
still
games,
there?
What?
Are those still there?
I wondered that. I was like, because we should look it up, and the next time we're both there, we should go to these bars.
Yeah,
because I want to see if they still have a machine or a plaque or something.
Yeah.
And the games made $30 a day, so that's pretty great money. That's like $200 a week. So, and the managers asked for more machines, and Donkey Kong quickly developed a huge following in the U.S.
All right.
And actually, due to the lack of funds that RoccoW, Judy, and Stone had, they decided to take those 2,000 Radar Scope machines that were just sitting there and convert them into Donkey Kong machines. So soon, all of those were gone, and they had a ton of orders that kept piling up to make new games. So they actually ended up starting manufacturing games at Nintendo of America. Instead of shipping them over, it became a manufacturing warehouse where they made games in Redmond.
Oh, so that's a little bit more efficient maybe, especially if you're selling a lot of games.
Yeah, they just could order parts instead of having to
Yeah.
ship whole units from Japan. The straight commission pay schedule that nearly bankrupted Ron Judy and Al Stone because they were paid on commission by RoccoW actually made them millionaires.
All right.
By the time Donkey Kong went out. There's a funny story about how Howard Lincoln, their lawyer, got a call from the accountant they used, expecting him to be like, we need to file for bankruptcy, when really he's like, we need to incorporate them because they're making too much money to just be people. They need to be a business.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, to keep their earnings. And now, this was a really exciting story. We're going to talk about one of the first female video game designers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and this is for a game called Bug Shooter, which is also known as Centipede.
Oh.
Which I've actually never played Centipede.
You know, I haven't either, but I've heard of it.
Yeah.
And I think I've seen it.
It's a very popular game.
Yeah.
After Asteroids, Ed Logg, who made that game, teamed up with Donna Bailey, and she was the only female programmer at Atari's coin-op division at the time. But before this, it was actually kind of interesting. Before she worked at Atari, Donna Bailey helped design the microprocessor-based cruise control in the Cadillac Seville.
Huh.
Yeah, if you like cruise control, I think we should all thank Donna Bailey for that.
Thanks, Donna Bailey.
Yeah.
Big
She
fan.
applied to work at Atari because she just loved video games, and she really wanted to be a writer, but she was like, I love video games, I'm going to do this for now. And there's, in the book, I didn't write this down in the notes, but there's actually a section there about Donna talking to a writer at the time for The New Yorker. Like, she did an interview because he was interviewing Nolan Bushnell, and she was a part of that interview. And she actually sent the writer some of the stories she wrote, and the writer was like, they're really, really good. Like, she should be a writer, you know, which is pretty cool. And actually, I looked her up after this, and she ended up working I believe, at the University of Arkansas, narrative writing program.
Well, that's good.
She's a professor now.
So it sounds like she got her
grade. Which has made me happy. So Edlog got the idea for Centipede from a book of game ideas. We talked about this, I believe, that Atari would have these brainstorming sessions, and they'd have game ideas, and they'd just write a very basic thing in this book that they then used for other people. Like when they were looking for a new game, they'd go to this book and they'd look through it and see something that caught their eye. And this game was called Bug Shooter in that book of ideas. So Log fleshed out the gameplay, and he did half the code, and then the rest of it went to Donna. And I'm going to say now a quote straight from the book that describes Centipede, because I got very confused trying to paraphrase this and how to describe the game. So I'm just going to, I do this another time down below too, but so this is a quote from the Ultimate History of Video Games. In Centipede, players used a trackball to move a cursor shaped like a snake's head along the bottom of the screen. The goal of the game was to shoot quick-moving centipedes as they appeared at the top of the screen and snake their way down. The centipedes were composed of 11 sections with legs, and each time a section was hit, it turned into a mushroom, and the rest of the centipede continued its nimble march down the screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're trying to shoot it all before it got to the bottom?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I heard the strategies for this game that way you would do it is when a centipede would hit a mushroom, it would change direction. So you could actually shoot the centipede and make it change directions, and you could set traps for it where you could make it go into a straight line down the side of the screen, so you could just shoot it all at once really fast, because the mushrooms would explode if you shoot them too.
Gotcha.
So that's how you kind of shoot the whole thing. That was. I want to play this game now. Actually, I want to try it.
Sounds fun.
There's got to be an emulator somewhere.
Yeah.
One of Donna Bailey's major contributions to Centipede was the color scheme, though. She used pastels, which had not been used before. And this game, they were really trying to market it towards women. And they think that might be one of the reasons it was so successful among women that played video games at the time. There was a famously bad Centipede tournament, though, held by Tournament Games at the Chicago Exposition Center on October 28th, 1981. And they were like, we're going to do a video game tournament for the first time. They usually did darts or billiards, but they're like, we're doing games. And we have 250 Centipede machines.
Oh, boy.
And they were going to have this tournament. The problem was they charged people for everything. They charged people for food, lodging. If you wanted to practice on their Centipede machines, you had to pay for quarters. And also, the game would shut off after 3 minutes. How can you practice?
Yeah.
So what ended up happening is not a lot of people showed up to compete, and then teenagers couldn't compete because it was just too expensive.
Right.
And there were a couple winners, and then when the winners got their checks, the checks bounced, and Atari had to cover it. And they still got sued. Atari still got sued for this, but they had to cover the costs, which I thought was pretty awful.
Sounds terrible.
The next game we're going to talk about is Tempest. I'd never heard of Tempest.
I mean, I've heard of it, but this is another one that predates my video game expertise.
So once again, we're gonna go. It was made by Dave Thurer, and he created Missile Command, another guy who created a popular hit. But this was another idea that was found in that brainstorming book, and this one just said first-person Space Invaders was the idea in the book.
Okay.
So what he did is he used a new technology called a vector graphic generator, called the XY generator, that created color lines for vector graphics.
Ooh.
Yeah, which was very fancy. And actually, Tempest, Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, Gravatar, Black Widow, Space Duel, Quantum, and Major Havoc were the only games to ever use this generator. And there is a reason why, which I will explain at the end of this. Originally, Gene Lipkin and Frank Ballouz, played the game at a meeting and said it was boring. This game is not really that fun. And then, because it just was just very basic Space Invaders. And then Third told them that he had a nightmare about monsters coming out of a hole in the ground. And they're like, why don't you try that? Because this is what game designing was like at the time.
I had a dream. I was trying to make that, I guess.
Yeah, let's make that into a thing. And so that's actually what he did. It ended up being the game that used the track knob to shoot aliens around this hole that would come out. And the track knob would move your gun around the hole. Originally, it would move the hole around, and that for some reason made people sick to their stomach. People got nauseous playing the game, so they had to make it so the gun traveled around the hole that the monsters came out of, and you couldn't actually manipulate the hole itself. They also here's another quote from the book on how Tempest gameplay worked. Players used a spinning knob to control a fast-moving C-shaped polygon that moved around the top of geometric cylinders with a spider-like crawl, and shot at flippers, which were large red X's, fuse balls, which are multicolored balls, pulsars, which are yellow lines that gave deadly shocks, and enemies as they tried to climb out of the tube. So you were like shooting things coming out of this hole. It really was exactly like his dream.
Yeah, like that scene in Star Wars.
Yeah. And then Tempest was a hit, but it had a lot of maintenance issues. And this is what we're talking about with the XY graphics generator, is it caused a lot of heat.
Oh.
So he actually would like play the game and then look at the back, and some of the like soldering had melted off the game.
The
like,
original
that's how
red
hot.
ring.
Yeah, that's how it got hot again. The original red ring. That's great. Yeah, it was the original red ring. Also, there was another problem. Once Thur heard rumors that kids had found a way to give themselves 40 free games, and there was a glitch. So what happened, and I'm going to try to explain this to the best of my ability, but it's kind of confusing. There was security code software that Thur had put in his game to make sure no one could pirate it.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, he noticed the Atari logo was off. So he redid the code to center the Atari logo. And because of that, and the security code he had in there, it caused a glitch where once a player hit 179,480 points, a 40 would go into the counter of coins and credits in the machine.
Huh.
It's just a weird glitch. And once again, give it up to kids to figure this out. They figured out how they could play the game for hours and hours on end. And I mean, the whole point of an arcade is to make people lose a game in 2 minutes and then put another quarter in. And if they can't do that, it's a problem. So Tempest had a lot of issues that owners would complain about, but it still was a big hit. Now, this is where Thur got annoyed because Atari, while he was making Tempest, had announced it would make a new bonus plan. For coin-op games that became hits, you would get a bonus as a designer. They decided not to instill this plan until right after Tempest came out. And Thur had 2 hits now, 2 big hits, Missile Command and Tempest.
Uh-huh.
And he couldn't get any extra bonuses for them because...
Yikes.
Yeah, he just essentially...
What year was Tempest?
Tempest was 19... I think it was 1981. I think
Okay.
this game came out
Yeah,
in
that
1981.
sounds about right. We'll get to that point. We'll talk about some of that stuff a little bit later, too, with the
Bonus.
compensation of engineers.
It was pretty bad. So with this coin-op craze, I will say that game places started popping up in unlikely businesses. Arcades did. So the Hilton Hotel in Rydtown, New York opened a arcade called Bagatelle Place.
Oh.
If you remember Bagatelle, that's what
Yes.
they named after it. They actually really purposefully did that because it sounded fancier. A formal arcade with 33 games, a cappuccino bar, and a strictly enforced dress code.
Only the finest.
Yeah, you must wear your tuxedo while you play Space Invaders. Nevada casinos at this time also replaced a lot of their gambling slot machines with arcades because they made more money.
Mm-hmm.
And then Hawaii opened an arcade called the Rainbow Bazaar in Waikiki.
Oh, man.
And this was just a giant, like a whole floor of this giant mall and tourist area that people could play arcade games at.
Dang.
So they made a lot of money.
Would have liked to be a game player in this era.
It would be so fun.
Yeah. It sounds really expensive.
Oh yeah,
Like
quarters.
if you were a gamer, you were spending quarter after quarter after quarter. We complain about loot boxes today, but man,
that adds up.
Yeah, that adds up. If it wasn't cheap to be. It's never been cheap to be a gamer. Let's put it that way.
No, it really hasn't. So now we're going to talk about the big hit game at the time, Miss Pac-Man.
Oh.
And interestingly enough, Miss Pac-Man was not created by the creator of Pac-Man, Toru Iwatani. Miss Pac-Man was created by 9 college students led by 2 MIT students, Doug McRae and Kevin Coran. And when Doug McRae was a junior in college, he owned a small coin-op route on the MIT campus, and he had a Gottlieb Pioneer pinball machine he got as a gift from his brother, and then he bought 3 Missile Command machines. And this is kind of how he made money while he was in school.
Oh, that would have been a great idea.
It's a really cool thing he actually did. But Missile Command at the time had kind of lost popularity as newer games came up, and people were good at it to the point where they could put a quarter in and play the game for an hour.
Oh.
So he wasn't really making a lot of money. So what he decided to do, instead of scrapping the game and selling it to other people, he's an engineering student. So him and his friend, Kevin Coran, decided they were going to update their games and not sell them. So what they did is they decided to take the original missile command code and make a board on top of it that was an overlay board that would enhance the game. So they essentially were not, they were actually completely taking the old code and changing it.
Wow.
So that way, because they were really afraid of copyright infringement. They didn't want to get in trouble for that. So they would, and they ended up actually taking and making Super Missile Command, is what they called it. And that had missile shooting jets, UFOs, a laser UFO, and a whole new color scheme.
Oh, wow.
So they were trying to make a new game out of it. And they ended up actually selling these boards, the enhancement boards, because it would just seriously go like right on top of the existing board.
Oh, to make sure they're not actually copying the old stuff, they're just modifying it sort of as it's being executed. That's interesting.
They're creating a whole new thing to add on top of it. And they decided to sell their enhancement kits under the name General Computer. That was their company name. And they could make one for $30 and they could sell it for $295.
Ooh, that's a good profit.
Yeah, and they sold more than 1,000
Nice.
that summer. So next, they decided they were going to work on a game called Pac-Man and mod that game. And that was made by Midway, if you remember. Mm-hmm. But while the missile command code was super simple, like it was very streamlined, the Pac-Man code was much more complex. It took twice as long disassembling the code and trying to figure out what they needed to add. And during this time, Atari decided to sue. In August of 1981, they sued General Computer for copyright infringement. And Atari didn't care that they were changing the code. What they cared about is people wouldn't want to buy new machines if they could just buy an enhancement card instead.
That makes sense.
So they sued them for that reason. And then what ended up happening with the lawsuit is they went back and forth. I think they had like multiple depositions and like injunctions and stuff like that. And then Skip Paul, who was Atari's general counsel, finally just asked McRae and Coran, what do you want from this? And they said, we just want to design video games. And he's like, oh, well, in that case, we'll do this. And Skip struck a deal where Atari would drop the suit with prejudice, which means they're admitting they're wrong.
Wow.
And that it wasn't copyright infringement. And they would then pay McRae and Coran $50,000 a month for the next 2 years to develop games if they would stop making enhancement kits.
Everybody wins.
Yeah, and McRae and Coran were like, yeah, we agree with that 100%.
That sounds great. I just want to make games, and if you're going to pay me for that, then I'll stop doing what you don't want me to do.
Yeah, they're like, sure. And the funny thing, though, is they still had Pac-Man, and they couldn't release Pac-Man. So what they did is they went to Bally Midway, the company that owned Pac-Man, and they said, hey, we got this game. We can sell you our cards. And they're like, well, how about this? How about you just design the sequel to Pac-Man for us? Because we don't have one yet. They didn't make one yet. They were just still making Pac-Man machines. And so they were like, yeah. And so General Computer turned Pac-Man originally into a character called Crazy Otto, who had legs and would run around and eat stuff. But Midway said, ditch the legs, make it more like the original Pac-Man. But McRae and Coran wanted to add their own spin on the game, so they were like, we're going to make it a female character. But they went back and forth with people. They wanted originally Pac-Woman, but people thought that would be straight, it wouldn't work. Yeah. And then Mrs. Pac-Man, because this is funny, they were worried. Apparently they released like some cartoons after Pac-Man was released, where Pac-Man had a girlfriend, and they were worried if they called it Miss Pac-Man, it would be like they're together out of wedlock, and it would be a weird thing. So they were doing Mrs. Pac-Man. But then they were like, you know what? Miss Pac-Man just sounds better. So we're going to do that. So they did Miss Pac-Man.
Ms. Pac-Man.
Ms. Pac-Man, yeah. Midway never actually built a new board for Miss Pac-Man. They would build Pac-Man boards and send them to General Computer. General Computer would put their enhancement board on top, and that was Miss Pac-Man.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, that probably was easier for Midway to not have to like do a whole new assembly line of just being like, we'll just keep making the same things we make. You guys keep making the same things you make, and we'll just
put them together.
Yeah.
If anything, I think all they have to do is make a new cabinet.
Yeah.
That's it. So the ghost names were changed. Inky, Pinky, and Blinky were still there, but they changed Clyde to Sue in honor of McRae's sister. His sister's name was Sue, which I thought was kind of nice.
Right.
Yeah. Miss Pac-Man was faster. It had 4 mazes instead of 1, 4 variants. It did not have preset paths. In Pac-Man Original, you could like outwit the ghosts. If you turned a certain time, it would make the ghost turn. You can't do that in Miss Pac-Man. The fruit would also run around the maze with you. It wouldn't just stay in one place. And then Miss Pac-Man had her famous red bow on her head and lipstick. So those were the big changes. Midway sold more than 100,000 Pac-Man and 115,000 Miss Pac-Man machines in the United States.
Wow.
No other game has sold that many cabinets at all.
Dang, and they sold way over twice that much.
Oh yeah,
that's crazy.
They never sold anything more than 100. No other company has sold anything more than 100,000 units except for those two games.
Wow.
Other Pac family games followed. Junior Pac-Man was one of them, and then Dave Nutting. Remember Dave Nutting from a while back? He made a game called Baby Pac-Man, and that was a maze chase game mixed with pinball.
Nice.
Yeah, which I thought was pretty cool. McRae and Coran eventually did sue Midway, claiming that they were the ones that created the Pac-Man family, and they won.
All right.
So yeah, because they were like making all these offshoots of Pac-Man, and McRae and Coran were like, actually, we made Miss Pac-Man, and that's the first family member, so this was our idea.
Whoa.
Yeah. So
that's a weird kind of thing, because it's like, yeah, but we made Pac-Man, so
yeah.
Wow.
Strange. Those two, I gotta tell you, apparently if you go to MIT, you're gonna end up making a lot of money. I think this is what we learned from this podcast.
Go to
you
MIT,
got a new goal, kids. Go to MIT. Next, we're going to talk about a little technology called Digital Me. This was in 1980 created by Ralph Baer.
Oh, the dude.
Yeah, the dude, maker of the Magnavox Odyssey, arguably the father of video games. I said it, Nolan Bushnell, you heard me. He invented a way to personalize video games. So what would happen is there would be a camera on the arcade machine, and it would take your picture in black and white, and then your picture would show up on the game, so everyone could see you're playing this game. That's really cool.
That's neat.
And then the idea was if you got a high score, that picture would then be permanently on there, and your high score would be up there. Now, people were like, this
pretty dangerous.
Is a really awesome idea. And the first day, it was a huge hit. And the second day, dude dropped his pants in front of the camera, and then it was over.
This is why we can't have nice things.
No, you really can't. But what this machine did make is you remember the old? It's hard to, I guess they call it it's a photo that moves, like it's a digital photo that moves as your character, essentially. I think I played a Batman Forever game for Sega Genesis that had this technology in it, where it looks like a picture of a person moving.
Oh, yeah.
And the famous game was Journey. Apparently the band Journey had a game where you would like lead them through these levels, and it was like they used the photo technology to put their real faces on the characters, so it looked really detailed.
That's cool. That's the way to do that. I remember the Game Boy Camera had some mini games in there. Actually, one of them was Space Fever, which we mentioned earlier. One of the failed Nintendo games.
Yeah.
But on the Game Boy Camera version, you take a picture of yourself, and like then you would be in the game.
That's so cool.
Yeah,
yeah, I like that. Midway thought this would help sell more games, this technology. But at this point, the arcade industry was starting to decline.
Oh,
this is the end of the golden age.
Okay.
The decline hit in mid 1982. It was not a crash; it just stopped growing. That was a big point they made in the entire book. That it wasn't like it suddenly everything fell apart. It was a very slow decline. Like first, small shop owners defaulted on their leases for their games. So they would lease the game from the company and like a lease to own thing, and then pay that game off easily with the sales. But the problem was if they're not selling and they're not popular anymore, they're not going to make money and be able to pay off their leases. Also hit were large, recently built arcades. One example they give is an arcade called Castle Park, a multi-million-dollar, 17,000 square foot arcade operation in Riverside, California, that just opened and closed.
Oh,
it was just bad
went
timing.
Too big.
Yeah, it was just way too big. It couldn't clear the amount to pay off its lease. Even the releases like Q*bert, Donkey Kong Jr., Pango, Joust, and Robotron 2084. These are new games that are really famous that came out at this time. They weren't enough to save the industry. Like, it was a novelty, and that novelty was kind of dying.
People were kind of getting sick of it.
Yeah, they were getting over it. Lawsuits also changed during this time. Originally, lawsuits among video game companies were about patents. But now, lawsuits were about names, ideas, and titles, and licensing.
IP.
So, for example, IP, exactly. So, Jungle King was a game very much inspired by Tarzan, where you played a hero rescuing a kidnapped woman in the jungle. You're chasing her captors like through the jungle, and Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated was the entity that held the rights to Tarzan, and they sued Taito for that game, and they had to change their name and then change the character to an explorer in like a Patagonian jungle suit to make it not stand out. But you mentioned this, you foreshadowed this. The biggest case came much later, among Universal Studios
and
Nintendo. And the judge called it A Tale of Two Gorillas. And that is the next chapter I will be doing that we're not going to talk about today. Because it's kind of... Okay. We got to kind of explain this, I think. It splits right now where there's chapters about arcade and chapters about consumer.
Yeah, the home console market.
And those and so I just did the arcade chapter, and now Tyler is going to do the home chapter.
We're on to the battle for the home. So before we get started here, I know we've sort of mentioned this a few times in past episodes. We talk about the Atari VCS, the video computer system. That is the same thing as the Atari 2600. It just would not be known as a 2600 until after 1982. So we say VCS or 2600. We kind of use them interchangeably here. So just wanted to clear that up. But we're going to take a little bit of trip because we left on 1982 with you in the arcades. We're going to take a little bit of a trip back in time, back to 1977 when they first started making games for the VCS.
I'm wearing bell bottoms.
Yes, you are. Groovy long hair. Yeah.
You feel groovy.
That's right. So when they started making VCS games, they only had 4 programmers making games for the entire system. They just had 4 people, and all the games were made by those 4 people. They later expanded this to 8 people with Larry Wagner as the manager. It's just crazy to me that there were only 8 people, at least in the early days, making games for the 2600. You can't even make a single game with 8 people now. They were making every single game, those 8 people.
Do it in months, right?
Yeah, they do it in 3 or 4 months.
That's crazy.
Yeah, they just didn't take that long. Nolan Bushnell still in control of Atari at this time, and he's pretty lax in his management. People come in late, they leave early, they party, whatever. But at this point, he was still pretty big on what I like to call the old swoop and poop, where he would come in, tell people to make changes, he would take off, and then would come back a couple weeks later, tell them those changes that they made were wrong. And then he'd take off again.
No one likes the swoop and poop management style.
That's right. Swoop and poop's bad management style. And at this point in the console division, it was super, super cutthroat. Coin-op engineers usually lasted a couple of years before they moved on to other stuff. And the home console, the programmers rarely made it longer than a year.
Yeah, it sounded really intense.
Yeah, they would form cliques, and they didn't like each other, and it was just a very different vibe from the coin-op, which I think is interesting. It took them 3 or 4 months to make a game, which is usually just one person working on it, and it would be that one person doing everything. They would code the game, they would do the art for the game, they would do the music for the game, they would do the sound effects for the game. But this all changed when they brought in Marilyn Churchill from marketing. She started doing some art stuff, which sort of eased the burden on the programmers and also upped the production quality and art as well.
That's awesome.
So that's
thanks, Marilyn.
Yeah, this is where the term programmer art sort of comes from. If you've ever seen a game in early development where the programmer is doing the art for it because they're just trying to test ideas or whatever, and you're just this does not look good at all. This is terrible, and it's MS Paint drawings of things. And it's just terrible,
stuff we would do.
Yeah. This is games that I would make. The first generation of VCS games were mostly just ports of coin-op games. They would say, "Hey, we have this really popular arcade game. Why don't you make it into a cartridge?" And the people that made the coin-op or the console games were like, "Okay," and they would take it and they would have to sort of dumb it down a little bit because the 2600's CPU power wasn't as powerful as you could get in an arcade. The other thing with arcade machines is you could make a system that was tailored to the kinds of things you needed in that game, whereas a home console needs to be sort of generalized. So you end up with a console that can do a lot of things, just not all of them very well. Arcade machines could be a little more specialized. So anyway, you had to shrink these arcade games down, which was kind of tough to do. But once they finished that first generation, they had moved on to their second generation where they were able to start making their own concepts. A lot of the quotes at this point in time from those developers were after I made the console port of Space Invaders, then they let me make whatever I wanted. And so we started to get a little bit more diversity in games. Home console games started to become a little bit different from arcade games. David Crane made a football game, and Alan Miller made a basketball game. The basketball game is neat because it actually has some kind of 3D effects going on.
I remember reading that. Yeah, it sounded like he was really excited because this is also sports market is huge. So.
Yep. Yeah. And there we'll talk a little bit more about the sports market from another company. But it was at this point in time, the engineers were not making as much money as they should have for the long hours and the creativity that they needed to have. They could have done this job elsewhere at other engineering companies. It could have been an engineer elsewhere, and they would have made way more money.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a little bit of foreshadowing for how kind of the fall of Atari, I guess, because they failed to recognize in time that they were going to be losing a lot of their folks, which is too bad.
Yeah.
So the launch of the VCS, at CES, they showed it in June of 1977, I think, and they had 4 games ready to go when they announced the VCS. And by the time they were ready to launch, it had 9 games.
Ooh.
Yeah, 9 whole games. It came packed in with combat, which was actually a lot of different games. There's like 36 different games, and they were all just like variations of tank battle. Yeah. Sort of like if you buy like one of those NES cartridges, it has like 95 games in one, and they're all just kind of variations on Super Mario Brothers with different like art.
When I was a kid, my Nana got me one of those really cheap, like you get them at like the drugstore, like handheld games that played like 100 different games, and I loved that thing.
Yeah.
I loved it so much.
And all the games are just more or less the same thing.
Yeah, I think we get to handheld games soon, by the way, everybody. Just so you know.
Yeah. I'm excited.
Oh yeah, like it's like I was like, I saw that chapter coming up, and I'm like, ooh, we're gonna get that. That's with me too. So we're gonna talk about early handhelds next week. Sorry, go ahead, Tyler. I got excited.
The other games that they launched with were Blackjack, a game called Surround, Basic Math for your education-minded.
Ooh.
Video Olympics, which was a lot of just Pong kind of variations. Air Sea Battle, Starship, Street Racer, Indy 500. So that's a lot of games. That's a pretty good launch lineup. Like I remember when the Nintendo 64 launched, and it was literally just Super Mario 64 and Pilot Wings.
Oh yeah,
that was it. That was all you could get.
I didn't. Oh, that was that low.
Yeah.
I like it when this area of games now where they just tell you exactly what it is in the title. We're gonna play Basic Math, and you know exactly what that is.
Yeah. I wonder what Blackjack is.
Yeah.
The 2600 sold for $199, which is pretty good by today's standards. Actually, $817 in today's money.
Ooh.
So this is a pretty expensive little endeavor.
They made so much money on these things.
And there were 9 games, and you didn't even get all the games. You got Combat, which was, to be fair, 36 games in one.
I mean, look at all those tank games you could play.
That's right. Yeah. So $817 worth of tank games. Their first winter season, first holiday season, they had some shipping problems, and they really didn't sell as many as they thought they were going to. They did still outsell the Channel F, which was its chief competitor at this time, the Fairchild Channel F, which came out before the VCS, and it was cheaper. But we come back to this. It didn't have the games.
Channel F doesn't have no games.
Channel F has no games. So it just didn't have the games. And as we all know, that's what it's all about. It's all about the games.
Yeah.
The Muckety Mucks up at Warner, who now owned Atari, weren't super happy with this. Steve Ross, the chairman, wondered if they had made a mistake in purchasing Atari. Bushnell was like, no, you didn't make a mistake. Here's what we need to do. Abandon the VCS. Let's make a new console that's more powerful, and we'll have more fun games. And Steve Ross was like, your first console's not doing great. Why would we abandon it and make another one?
This made me wonder if this time, like, you could say that Steve Ross and the Warner, like, brothers execs made it. Well, it wasn't Warner Brothers. I think it was just Warner at the time.
Oh yeah.
If they possibly slowed progress of video game consoles for like 6 years.
Yeah, maybe.
You know, like, what if we'd have gotten the N64 6 years earlier?
Wow.
That'd be kind of crazy, right?
Yeah.
I wonder if that's like, I don't know if that happened. We'll see what happens when the other chapters go along. But I thought about that. Like, did they slow it down?
Yeah. And this is a different period. This is like a different era in like consumer products too, where consumer products would come out and they would get better. Like they were slowly improving over time. It's not like they've been using the same things for hundreds of years or whatever. But I don't think that the traditional like executive group in the 70s were quite aware of how fast technology was going to move, to where it was like, we already have a console, we will not need to make another one, right? Because we have a thing. Like, you don't say like, oh, we have a Power Rangers toy, we need to make a newer, better Power Rangers toy. You just say, well, we have this, just keep selling it, right?
Yeah.
And so they didn't really recognize how fast technology was going to move, and that this was going to be, there was going to need to be sort of a pace sustained, and like the competition would catch up and they would get ahead of you, and that would be a problem. It was just a different time where you bought a thing and it lasted for 10 years.
Yeah, and it's funny now, too, because now everything's around innovation.
Yeah.
Like every new iPhone.
Every year.
Yeah, you got to have a new phone, it's pretty crazy when you think about it that it's completely changed.
Yeah, and back in those days, you bought a phone, that was your phone.
Yeah.
You didn't buy a new one unless you broke it and you couldn't repair it, right? Phones were the same from 1920 till 1960, right? It was all the same.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's just a different time.
Yeah, it was just a different time. So it was harder to convince, like, hey, I know we just made a console 4 years ago. We need to make a new one. It was like, no, we just keep making the same one. So that's what sort of bites them in the butt, I think.
Yeah.
It's just a different time. So in 1978, when Bushnell was ousted by Warner and they brought Ray Kassar in, he became the CEO. Nobody trusted Ray Kassar because he had this same kind of mentality of like not really respecting the culture that they had and like how things were going to go. And so people were really worried that they were going to lose what made Atari. They were going to worried that Atari was going to lose its soul. Alan Miller's quoted as saying he was destined to run that company into the ground.
Whoa.
He'd been to Harvard, and he was just like he wore suits, and he was just generally seen as like the antithesis of what Atari stood for.
He was like a fancy pants, right?
Yeah, he took the executive, like their dining area for executives, and made it into like a super fancy restaurant where like they flew in these really fancy chefs every day to like make food for them and stuff.
Crazy.
Which is not really what Atari was about at that point in time. It was a bunch of hippies.
Seems pointless and like excessive.
Yeah. So for his faults, though, we'll get into this, but Kassar's not all bad. He saw a lot of problems. He saw bad marketing. He saw no quality assurance. Sears kept complaining about defective VCS units that they were getting, and nobody at Atari seemed to care or wanted to do anything about that. And this was starting to really put a strain on Atari's relationships with their retail partners because that's what it's all about, is like making sure that these things stay on shelves. And if Sears can't reliably sell a product and people keep bringing it back because it's broken, that's a problem for Sears. That's going to be a problem for Atari. People didn't really see that. Kassar saw that. He wanted to fix this. But he had those weird things that he was into, like the really expensive office furniture too. He's like, you got to pay a price if I'm going to fix your company. So people didn't really like him, but he did turn the company around. He made a lot of money. They went from making $75 million in a year to $2.2 billion in a year.
That's so much. Yeah.
With Kassar at the helm.
I can't even be mad. Like, you can't be mad at this guy because what he did. He's like, it's one of those professional execs things. It's like, he's just really good at turning it around.
Yeah. He turned it around. One year they made $400 million after taxes, which was like the most that any company had ever made at that point in time. Like they broke the record, which was pretty crazy. The most profitable company in the world.
That's crazy.
Yeah. At this point, the coin-op division felt like Kassar didn't care about them and that he only cared about the accomplishments of the home console division, because that's where most of the money was starting to come in from, because people were buying these things in their home and they kept buying games. And it was just a little bit more profitable for Atari than the coin-op division, I think. But all the engineers, whether they were coin-op engineers or console engineers, they all really disliked him. They just were not a fan. And a lot of that was because he had a policy that made sure programmers didn't receive public credit for the stuff that they did.
That's so mean. It's so messed up.
Games were made by Atari, and like it didn't matter who made it. Game was made by Atari, and that was it. And so that sort of like as game designers sort of started to see themselves become these like directors and like artists and auteurs, like it would be crazy to not give the director credit for a movie that they directed, right? You wouldn't just say, well, Marvel Studios made this movie, and then give no credit to the director or anybody else in the movie. But that's how it was at Atari at the time, and that would definitely come back to bite them. There's a nice little Easter egg, which if you've seen Ready Player One, you know all about this, but it is an important part of video game history.
I loved it. I didn't know it's because of this policy is why he did it.
Yeah, so this is the reason that the Easter egg in the game Adventure that Warren Robinette made, it was actually a port of a text-based game for computers. He made a graphical version of it for the Atari, and he put a thing. You had to do a whole bunch of stuff, find the right key, and take it to the right room. When you got there, it would show a room that showed his name.
It said made. It didn't say like made by Robinette.
Yeah,
like
made by
flashy.
Robinette.
I thought that was so cool. And then some kid in Salt Lake City sent him a letter and found it.
Yeah, he was like, I didn't think anybody would find this. He didn't tell anybody about it because he knew he'd be fired.
That's a great secret, though.
Yeah.
Just to not, he said he didn't even tell his best friends about it.
Yeah, he was like, if I can't be trusted to keep this secret to myself, I shouldn't be trusting anybody else to keep this secret. So he never told anybody because he didn't want to get fired, and he was worried that they would like recall or stop manufacturing the cartridges and like do a remaster of it. And that was pretty expensive to do at the time. To start manufacturing a cartridge was like $10,000,
dang,
which is pretty expensive. And that room with that Easter egg took up about 5% of the storage.
That was what threw me. I'm like, that's like what? Because it felt like you're like, what's the big deal? It's just a little room. But then when you're like, how small those cartridges were.
Yeah. And
he's wasting not wasting, but putting 5% of it with his name on it.
Yeah. There would be strong incentive for Atari to be like, stop making that game. We need to make the cheaper version that doesn't have that thing in it.
I love it. I love it so much.
That's great. Yeah. At this point, we're moving into an era that I'm calling the Great Migration.
Like geese.
Indeed.
Or other birds.
Like geese or other birds.
We're not scientists.
We are not avian experts.
I want to be more of a bird nerd. Let's work on that.
What's the term for a bird bird?
Ornithologist?
Ornithologist. That's what it is. You got it.
I know that because Jurassic Park.
Yeah. All right. So at this point, Space Invaders had come out, and it had sort of reignited further interest in video games, both coin-op and home consoles. They were both kind of... Space Invaders was like, it's a great new game that everybody really liked. So the VCS didn't do so well in the holiday of 77, but they did pick up and sell throughout the year, so that wasn't dead by any means after then. But at this point, a challenger approaches.
Dun, dun, dun.
Remember our homies at Magnavox?
Oh, I do.
Those guys that made the Odyssey?
I do.
Well, they made an Odyssey 2.
Ooh.
Yeah. This one had a built-in keyboard, which was pretty neat. Didn't fool anybody into thinking it was a computer, though. Which I'm not sure if that's what they were going for. If they wanted people to think it was like a home computer, but they didn't. They weren't able to fool anybody with that. It was not a home computer. It was a video game console.
That's weird. That
yeah.
That. It's a weird choice.
It did not do well.
Oh.
So that's a bummer. A big part of why the Atari did so well was because they spent $5 million on marketing. Ray Kassar knew what was up, and he knew that he needed to spend a lot of money on marketing. And they sold all 400,000 of their units that they had in storage, and they ramped up capacity. They wanted to make more. And then they licensed Space Invaders.
Whoa.
Yeah. So they got Space Invaders from the company that made the arcade version. They made a VCS version of it, and it was awesome. Best-selling game of 1980. Which is pretty sweet.
I'm telling you, as much as you can't like that guy for his suits and his fancy pants, like he's good at business.
Yep.
That Mr. Business.
That's right, Mr. Business. And that was a new trend. They had already done a lot of like arcade conversions. This wasn't like the first arcade conversion. Like we said, a lot of the early games were arcade conversions. But this sort of ignited this like arcade games in your home. That's the selling point. Buy an Atari, you'll have an arcade in your home, right?
Know, I think personally, if I was alive at this time, I would have been wanted to be the arcade at home kind of guy. Yeah. But I do think the idea of going to an arcade and eating cheese fries while playing a game sounds great.
Yeah.
We could recreate that at home, though.
Yep. We could recreate.
We could recreate that right after this.
Let's get some cheese fries. Oh, the problem was though that Kassar and his group of execs didn't know anything about the technology. They still they made kind of demands that it was clear they didn't know what they were talking about, and the programmers and engineers just didn't like them still. Alan Miller left in 1979 after he wanted more money and ownership over what they were making. He was like, this is an art. I want to be treated like other popular artists. I want some more money here because I'm making you money here. And him and a bunch of other designers sort of teamed up, and they tried to negotiate better terms, and they were not given those better terms. They worked their way up the chain, and Kassar was like, nah. So they didn't get the money that they thought they deserved, and so a lot of them left, and they started a brand new company called Activision.
Ooh.
Activision started in 1980. By CES in June, they were ready to show their products, so they moved quickly. Michael Katz, who was a former marketing director at Mattel Toys, thought they were nuts. He was like, we got enough Atari games. Nobody needs any more Atari games. There's so many, right? Mm-hmm. There's just two. We covered them. We made all the games.
It's too many games.
There's too many games. Atari has too many games. Which is another interesting, sort of goes along with the people not being aware of how the video game industry would eventually work, of just being like, we made all the games. That's it. They're all made. You can't make any more. We don't need any more games, right? And it's now it's very clear. If you had said that about movies, we made all the movies.
Yeah.
There's no more movies to be made. You would be laughed at. Yeah.
We just did the Casablanca and no more.
That's it.
Shut it down.
So yeah, Michael Katz, he thought they were crazy. Nobody needed any more Atari games. He was proven to be wrong. At this point, nobody but Atari made games for the VCS, though. Activision did. They wanted to make Atari games, and Atari didn't really like that. This wasn't the first time that like a software company would make software for another hardware. Like all kinds of software companies wrote programs for the Apple II or the other computers, you know. But for video games, this was kind of a sort of unprecedented thing. And normally, like a company like Apple would want as many people to be writing software for it as possible because they made money selling the computer, right?
Yeah.
But Atari made money selling the games. They did not make very much money selling the console. And so if somebody else was making money selling games for their console that they're losing money on, that was not okay with Atari. And so they sued Activision a lot. They sued them all the time. Every 6 months. They were suing them over something. And then Atari realized that they were constantly losing programs to Activision and to other third-party companies, and they realized it's because they weren't paying them well enough. Once all the good ones were gone, that's when they started paying royalties, like we were talking about.
Yeah.
But all the good ones were gone, and so the ones that stayed, they got their royalties, but it was just, by then it was too little too late. We had opened Pandora's box of third-party developers.
Third-party titles.
That's right.
Into it. Where would we be now without third-party titles? Seriously.
We would be in a very different place.
Yeah, very boring
and
place.
that could have been a pretty pivotal case. Well, it was a pivotal case for the video game industry. Imagine if that ruling had gone the other way. If a judge said, no, Activision, you can't make games for Atari's console. That's Atari's console.
Yeah.
The world would be so different right now.
Yeah.
Probably not as good.
I think all of us would be like, PS4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch got no games.
No games. All we got is Halo.
Could you imagine how they would do that with computers? Like if you bought a Dell computer and only came with Dell games?
Oh, jeez.
That would be awful.
I don't even want to know what kind of games Dell would make. Gosh. So we've been talking a lot about Atari. That's where the most of the interesting sort of drama is because they're the leader in the space, and so there's a lot of good stories there. There were other consoles besides the Atari, though. Coleco made their Telstar Arcade. It had a steering wheel and a gun, and it had like a standard, like a knobbed controller for the Pong likes of the era. It was also, the cartridges were like these weird triangles, which was kind of crazy.
Trying to be cool looking?
Yeah, trying to be different looking, I guess. It's sort of like the Coke bottle thing of like, even if you have your eyes closed, you're holding a Coke bottle, you know it's a Coke bottle.
Like a square burger patty at Wendy's?
That's right. That's because they don't cut corners.
They don't. They do not cut corners. I love it.
But they do on their buns. Buns are still circle.
Buns are circle.
Yeah. Mattel also made the Intellivision, which I think is a great name for a video game console. Like an intelligent television.
I like that.
Oh, so good.
It is a good name.
It's too bad
Great marketing, Mattel.
Yeah. They had made some handheld games before that, so they were not new to the video game space. But this was their first and I believe only console. It had newer, better hardware, better graphics. It was just great. They had a lot of sports games. They went deep on their sports things. They wanted every sport they could, and they licensed the games that they could. There were MLB games. I don't think there were any NFL games, but where they could, they were licensing games, which is pretty novel for the time. Yeah. And then that would bring in a new sort of demographic of people, which was sports fans. People that may not otherwise have been interested in video games now wanted to play football on their TV.
Yeah,
right?
like, challenge you MLB baseball on the Intellivision.
That's right. And it had a 12-key button pad, like a joystick disc thing, which is like a different kind of controller. At this point, controllers really hadn't been standardized the way they are today. And so every new console was like, we got to do something different. Our controllers got to be different.
I'm really curious to see how much one of these goes for today. I'm going to Google that right now while you keep talking, okay? Because I want to know.
Well, you better go fast because there's not a whole lot left here. Where we're going to leave you here is Atari has sort of lost control of their console to third-party developers. They've lost a lot of their programmers and engineers to those companies that are making games for the Atari. They made a lot of great decisions that made them very successful in these times, but their hubris and their poor decisions sort of led to them taking a nosedive, and it's not really going to get any better.
No, it's really not.
So that's where we leave you here this week.
I'll let you know that in Intellivision, if you want the full collection, someone is selling a complete collection for $5,000 with every game that's come out and everything with it.
That seems fairly reasonable, actually.
But if you want just an Intellivision, there's one for $20 on eBay. If you just want the console, you can make your own collection. Cool. Do it yourself, team.
That's right.
Yeah.
Cool.
I just think it's cool. Yeah. I'm excited to see where this goes. So I know my chapter next week definitely involves this lawsuit over Donkey Kong and Universal.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to see that, and I think. Yeah, I like this split we're doing. You're the console guy, and I'm the arcade guy, and eventually we'll just join forces again. But we're still together now, though. Yeah, it's great. I want to give a shout out to some people that left us reviews.
Oh yeah,
because we got a couple reviews, and I want to say thanks to Curtain Up and Harpax8484. Thank you so much for giving us 5-star reviews. It means the world to us. We appreciate you reviewing the podcast and then giving us your feedback. You can email us at codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet at me Coletta. You can tweet Tyler at SneakerElf. And Tyler, what have you been playing?
Well, still on that Destiny train.
Yeah, me too, man.
Oh, they showed the reveal for Forsaken trailer, and it looks great. And so I'm like reinvigorated to keep playing Destiny. I don't know if I'll keep playing it on a regular basis until this expansion comes out, but right now I'm having a lot of fun.
I'm having fun too. I like this faction rally thing they're doing. It makes things that used to be like, what's the point of this, fun again.
Yep. Yeah, so it's been fun. We just started playing Detroit Become Human today, which is pretty neat. It's the next game from Quantic Dream, the folks that made Heavy Rain and Beyond Two Souls. So it's kind of like a movie video game where you make choices, and those choices kind of affect how the game goes. So that's been pretty fun. I'm trying to think of what else I'm playing. I think it's really that. I did start up Splinter Cell Double Agent. I think I mentioned that last time we were talking.
I love how you're like, I've had kind of. It sounds like you made it sound like you had kind of a slow week, but you've been playing a lot of games.
Yeah, well, it's slow week in terms of number of games, but I haven't just been playing a lot of Destiny. I'm grinding that faction rally.
Dude, yeah, me too. I've been playing that faction rally a lot, and I've been trying to play. Oh, I played Eater of Worlds raid for the first time.
Oh, that's fun.
I had someone. I went. If you play Destiny and you want someone to help you, go to Reddit and go to Raid Sherpa. It actually is really good. Like I met someone there that like posted, and I commented, and they're like, yeah, and I messaged them, and we just did it in like an hour with a bunch of other. Like it was 2 people that had done it before, and then 4 of us that hadn't, and it was really fun.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so I really liked it. I've been like trying to walk more. So I've been playing these weird AR phone games. I've been trying some out. The Jurassic Park game, Jurassic World Alive is what it's called. I give it a 5 out of 10 is my score.
Okay.
Because, so the cool thing about Pokemon Go is you can walk and you could like throw a Pokeball. The Jurassic World one is a full-on like drone shooting darts mini game that you really have to focus on, and it makes it so you can't really play it as well.
You can't play it and walk it.
So I took it off my phone and I've been playing Pokemon Go again.
Oh yeah, I gotta get back into that because that Let's Go for Switch.
Yeah, Pokemon Let's Go Eevee, Let's Go Pikachu, and I think I might buy a Switch to play this game, hopefully with Tyler.
Yeah, dude,
I'm excited. Fun. I told my girlfriend about it, and I'm like, we're going to play Pokemon together because she's never played one. And so I'm like, this is an exciting time for the both of us.
This is the one to get in on it, I think.
For sure.
Yeah.
So,
cool.
You got anything else you want to tell the audience?
No, that's it.
And thank you guys so much for reviewing again. And if you could tell your friends, and like, we're just kind of doing a word of mouth thing to spread this around, I think. And we're on the Podaholics Network.
Yep.
You got to remember that. They have other great shows and articles on there. And with that, do you want to tell everyone anything before we go? Like, do you want to say you love them or bye or?
I love you and bye.